A real expert in childbirth is able to help a person navigate this whole system without imposing their own preferences and values on them. But again, we don't really have a lot of time with our OBs. Like, they're 7 minutes on average is the length of the visit. So when are we supposed to elicit those values? That's why I couldn't do what I do in the system. That's a big reason why I stepped away.
Welcome back to another episode of the Peak Performance Life podcast. Today, I am very excited to be to have an expert talking about a topic that we have not covered in over the 100 episodes that we've released here on the Peak Performance Life podcast. It's a brand new topic. It's a very, very important topic, especially for people in this time of life that we'll get into here in a second. But we have Nathan Riley, MD. He's a board certified OB-GYN and fellow of ACOG who left the medical industrial complex due to his disillusionment with the standard of care within the conventional maternity care model. And this was hard because going with the flow of hospital-based practice was providing him financial security. But on the other hand, standing in his truth from having sat with over 1,000 births and connecting with women and their families has provided him a lifestyle more in alignment with fatherhood, deepening his connection with his wife and caring for people in the way that he had anticipated long before stepping into practice. Dr. Riley now focuses his time on upholding the traditional practices of midwifery, and he supports midwives as a collaborative physician for midwives of all varieties in over 20 states. He's an advocate for at-home birth, still attends births for those in need, and boasts a C-section rate of less than 5%, which is one of the best in the U.S. And Nathan, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Man, it's my pleasure. I couldn't have said any of that better myself. I appreciate the gratuitous introduction. Thank you.
Absolutely. Let's start with a little bit of a background here. Let's kind of start to how did you kind of come up, obviously with your medical background, and then kind of what shifts and changes you made over the years?
Yeah, well, I took a pretty conventional approach, really. The only thing that was a little bit unusual about me when I entered medical school was that I was actively competing at the Ironman distance in triathlon. And so I had quite a bit of my now wife and I had met when we were 16. We separated when I went to med school. And for that summer before med school, I just was in the pool, running, biking, lifting weights, doing CrossFit. I was doing all of this stuff to make myself as healthy as possible. And, when you can make it through a 140 plus mile race and feel pretty good afterwards, and you eat a pizza and you do all that, you're like, man, I learned quite a bit in this sort of experimentation period of my life of maybe the prior 5 years, kind of dialing in my endurance, sort of attributes, as well as my strength. And I'd always looked at food labels, even as early as high school. And I thought, man, I would love to be able to apply a lot of this stuff in my medical practice. And so then you get into med school, and I was a little bit of an unorthodox. I didn't go straight from college there. I was actually a teacher in Korea in the meantime. But like I said, my partner and I split up at the time, and we eventually reunited and then had kids, and the rest is history, as they say. But I found myself really, really committed to this idea of preventing disease or even reversing disease through what is called lifestyle change, right? It's not really an appropriate term, lifestyle, because it's not like you're wearing like a Gucci suit or something. Like, this is the style of my life, because a lot of people I think are limited by time and their finances and whatnot. But if we could see systematic systematic change, could we improve the health of the people that we were there to serve? And I was like a full bore hell yes, but I didn't really get to experience that in medical school. There was just far too much to learn. There was not enough emphasis put on that. But I figured, hey, the magic, seeing a birth in med school, like, really compelled me to consider, like, what could we do if we could start working on young families whenever they were getting pregnant, when they had that glimmer in their eye of a baby, that's going to be coming in and helping to kind of level them up as adults. And so I went to LA for my residency, which is 4 long years, 100-hour work weeks on average. I mean, it was brutal, but I tried to maintain what I was doing for myself, but I just ended up blowing a fuse, ended up in adrenal fatigue. It wasn't the healthiest lifestyle, sleeping 4 hours, a night, and trying to get some drinks in on the weekend. And while, still eating organic food and all of that, just just running myself into the ground. And I remember back in residency, I was not on this like holistic OB-GYN path. I was mystified by birth, and I was mystified by the operating room. And so I remember taking the subway to Venice Beach from the Los Feliz, East Hollywood area in LA, which is about an hour and a half ride. And my goal was to tie 100 surgical knots with each hand, or 1,000, I'm sorry, with each hand by the time I got there. So I was like, bam, 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 bam. You know, I'm going to be the best surgeon, the best resident ever. But what I ended up actually learning in residency was not what you would imagine. I learned that family is supposed to come second. I learned that I'm supposed to be the captain of the ship. I'm supposed to have all the answers, and don't worry your sweet little head, you know, honey, I'm going to take care of everything. You know, I learned that birth is a medical procedure. I learned that I was never supposed to admit when I didn't know something or that I was at fault for making a mistake. I was never supposed to show weakness. I was taught that birth plans are a total joke, that midwives are incompetent. I learned that home birth was irresponsible, that pregnancy is a disease. And with a little bit of charm, you can convince any, quote, patient to go along with your plan. And I use air quotes there because if you're pregnant, you don't have a disease. You're not a patient. You're just a person looking for some support. And so that really rattled my cage quite a bit. It wasn't at all in alignment with how I lived or how I knew my wife would want to be cared for if we were to have kids. And so, fortunately, I had some great mentors, and I really was able to maintain my identity. I did fellowship in end-of-life care, hospice and palliative care, and I brought that into my practice and really was able to kind of see from a 30,000-foot view, how do I want to show up as a father, as a man, as a doctor, and as a husband? And that's really, I think, the sort of start of the conversation as to where I found myself now, working remotely, taking care of people on a very functional kind of uproot cause of disease, so to speak, and really showing up in home birth in order to provide people with patient-centered care through the lens of informed consent and upholding the midwifery model of care, because midwives generally do it better than us OB-GYNs. So that's a mouthful, but I'll let that simmer and we can go from there.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great start. So let's start with a couple of just the basics. And, a lot of people may not have ever thought of, at-home birth as an option. A lot of people listening now might not even know that that's an option, or they might think like it's way too risky. What if something happens? And in terms of midwives, can you also, I'm not actually sure what kind of training they have, or maybe just a little bit of background about defining what exactly a midwife is.
Yeah, well, like I said, a lot of what I learned in my training, and this goes for many people who are invested in the system, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And we're talking about the system of Western medicine, whereby we're using pharmaceuticals and surgery for virtually everything under the sun, not really providing people with the tools to, through solidogenesis, kind of reharmonize with their surroundings to live their best life. While I was there was this sense that if you were not going to have a hospital birth, how could you be so irresponsible? Like, how incorrigible that somebody would consider that path. Yeah. And then, but most of those people found a midwife who really provided them with like a lot of counseling, and they developed these great relationships with them. And I wasn't really able to have those relationships with people in the hospital. So it compelled me to, at least, I think this really goes for anything in our life. I mean, we just passed this period of really real hardship for many of us, and especially for young kids, this COVID moment where everybody was speaking as if they were certain about anything, regardless of where they fell in any argument around the dinner table with friends, with family, whatever news channel they watched. If something to you sounds really, really true, I just, sort of challenge everybody to ask, could the opposite also be true? And this really kind of draws into question for me. It did very early in my life, this safety that was advertised in hospitals. Like, is it really that safe? Like, is there any downside to being in here? Like, I certainly wasn't feeling very healthy. I was in adrenal fatigue. I was waking up all hours of the night to stick my hand in somebody's vagina. They weren't happy about that. Their nurses weren't happy about that, but this was the way we do things. So I was like, what if we didn't do that? Furthermore, what if we actually didn't come to the hospital at all to have a baby? And that kind of put me on a path where I was seeking out home birth midwives, and a particular doctor out in LA who's not practicing out there anymore, Stu Fishbein, who's become kind of a legend in the space, the OB-GYN who turned to home birth. And he does all of their very high risk births in the home and has incredible statistics to sort of back up his reputation. So
Mm.
then when I started doing that, I became re-enthralled again with home birth or with birth at all. And it was like, God, a home birth is such a different experience. And I don't see any difference in quote safety. In fact, when we have all this technology in the hospital, when we have an operating room down the hall, we tend to just have a lower threshold to utilize those technologies. One
Mm.
really important thing that most people who have kids will experience is a continuous fetal heart rate monitor that's on your belly the whole time you're in the hospital. We've never validated that. If anything, instead of changing cerebral palsy rates, which reflects, hypoxic injury in the uterus during birth, we
Mm.
actually just saw a skyrocketing of C-sections. So again, you're taught these things. There's this dogmatic way of doing things. But I really encourage everybody to consider, what if I looked at this from the other direction? And that's actually how we grow. That's actually how we become far smarter and wiser. Whether you're a doctor or a dad or, a freaking gardener, it's just a matter
Mhm.
of flipping the script a little bit and just asking questions. So at the same time, I also realized that the women who were having births at home felt empowered through their experience, and women who had, hospital-based births were generally a little bit stuck on something just not having felt right. And this has emerged in the field of trauma as birth trauma, where even if you had a natural, uncomplicated birth with healthy mom, healthy baby, something else happened. Like they felt like they were touched in a way that didn't feel consensual or spoken to in a way that felt coercive. And furthermore, they weren't giving any tools to take care of themselves. And then lastly, what I'll say is that we've also been at war with nature, as if synthetic hormones through, let's say, Pitocin in the hospital, that's comparable to this beautiful giant molecule called oxytocin that's both a neurotransmitter and a hormone that floods your baby with love. It's quite literally the agent that binds us to our babies. So we aren't seeing that in the hospital where this advertised safety is such a billboard.
Mm.
And at home, we're seeing these beautiful things happen. So I started studying what happens in this birth. Why did this woman have such a great birth versus focusing on that 1 in a million bad thing happening and
Right.
subsequently traumatizing my clients in an effort to minimize that 1 in a million down to zero? Because that's not possible. That actually reflects our war against nature and mortality in and of itself. So, um, I guess that's a roundabout way of saying that once I started opening up the possibility that home birth was a good idea, not only did I become a full-fledged advocate for home birth, and sometimes an advocate against hospital birth for 85% plus of women, but my wife and I actually gave birth at home ourselves with our second baby after having a hospital birth the first time. And it was the most to Laura, it was the most beautiful. It's so cliche, but it was probably the most important moment in my life, being there in our bedroom, on our bed, having a baby. I mean, it's just palpable. I still get feelings, like whole body feelings around how powerful that moment was. And I just
Mm.
hope that everybody can sometime feel that, because it is really, really, once you feel it and experience it, you really can't look back. Like you've seen behind the curtain, you've seen The Wizard of Oz, and now you're like, oh, I kind of see how this whole thing works.
Yeah. So what was the difference then? You had one hospital birth and one at home birth. What were some of the biggest differences?
Well, if you go to someone's house for dinner, you don't generally, kick your muddy shoes up on the sofa. Normally, you're pretty, I don't know, you want to kind of understand who they are and what their values are before you start messing around in their space. That
Hmm.
alone leads to so many differences. And what I always have people do when they come to me and I go to home births now, just as a FYI, what I
Hmm.
have people do early on is close your eyes and really imagine, what do you smell? Like, what are the voices? Who is there? What are you tasting? Like, what is your
Hmm.
experience? The whole ambience of the experience. And most people don't come up with any sort of dreamscape that looks anything like the hospital environment.
Right.
So
Right.
the entire experience changes. And I was taught that experience doesn't matter, but I will tell you that just because it's not measurable doesn't mean it's not important. How much do you
Yeah.
love
Yeah.
your child? How much do you love your partner? How sad was it to lose a parent? Like, those are not measurable things, but those are the things that
Mm.
actually get us up in the morning and are sometimes the most catastrophic things in our lives, but they're not measurable. So just because it isn't measurable doesn't mean it's not important. And when you get people in that dream space, the ideal sort of ambiance emerges, and it oftentimes is far more in alignment with home birth. So that's the big difference, is it feels like home, and that means a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Versus, you can imagine like hospital and machines beeping, loud
Oh
noises,
yeah.
and beeping, and all sorts of stuff going on there. And Yeah. So I know, and just real quick on the midwife thing, real quick, because yeah, I think some people might be curious, like, do they have to go through a certification or something, or like how do they, or is it just there's some sort of training, and then yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, I guess I didn't really answer that question. I get so caught up in like the emotional side of this, but
Yeah.
midwives generally attend home births. I mentioned that I go to home births, but I always try to defer to midwives in the area wherever people are reaching out. Sometimes people fly me out of state. They put me up for a month in an Airbnb and my family. Like that's really great, but why not just find a midwife?
Yeah.
People have characterized midwives for at least a century as these kind of lazy, incompetent sort of old maids that don't really have they're unclean, they're uneducated, and this and that. But midwives, they have as much education around natural birth as we have around surgical birth. So the
Mm,
real experts in childbirth oftentimes are actually midwives, because most people who are pregnant are not in need of a surgeon or a sick person specialist, both of which are the two real areas of, if you want to call it, expertise that OB-GYNs can claim.
yeah.
Midwives generally go through an apprenticeship model, similar to what maybe our parents in their generation would do to become tradesmen.
Hmm.
We haven't
Hmm.
really ever had that set up in medicine in the United States. Really, Rockefeller medicine, really through a large influx of philanthropic dollars, we adopted the German style of medical education, which included 4 years of college, 4 years of med school, then residency, and all the specialties and all of that. So the midwives do an apprenticeship model where you go and you do some formalized training for the most part. Not everybody does that, but some get formalized training and then they apprentice for as long as they need to get notches in their belt in order for them to feel comfortable going to births and managing anything, including emergencies, on their own.
Mm,
Certified nurse midwives are a type of midwife that work in the hospital. They start as RNs, generally speaking, and then they usually go for a doctorate level program where now they're basically an OB-GYN, but they don't do surgery. I mean, they do quite a bit of what OB-GYNs do. And sometimes that's actually a point of criticism from the masses who are like, hey, they're nothing like regular midwives because they didn't train through the apprenticeship model. The apprenticeship model was derived from this sort of lineage of midwives teaching midwives, women teaching women how to care for pregnant
mm,
women and how to attend births. And that model works really, really well. In fact, sometimes
mm.
midwives go together if there's an extra high risk patient, and or high risk client. So they generally have all of the tools that we would need, barring a full blown operating room and some other procedural things that we can do in the hospital. The good news is if something bad happens, there's always an emergency plan. I always have a plan in place. Okay, where's the hospital? I have it mapped out. I have it printed off on MapQuest just in case I have an issue with my GPS. We can go to the hospital. It takes 20 minutes. I'll even drive it sometimes to know the exits and all of that. Let's go if we have to. I've never had to do that, but we're always prepared to do that as our midwives.
Mm.
Fortunately, the transfer rate's generally under 10% for almost every midwife in the country. If you have a higher than 10% transfer rate, then maybe you do need some shoring up of some education or whatever. But it certainly beats 1/3 of babies coming by C-section in the hospital, 1/3 of babies being
Wow.
induced unnecessarily, all these extra pharmaceuticals and all this other stuff, the distractions and everything. A lot of people are saying, okay, there is maybe a slightly higher risk of us needing of us not being able to get to the operating room, which is 20 minutes away versus a ride down the hallway on a gurney. But the likelihood of that bad thing happening is sufficiently low, and the benefits of having a birth at home with a midwife who does have great training and has an apprentice there with them and a doula there and an extra set of hands. They're
Mm.
also trained in neonatal resuscitation. They're like, yeah, there's great benefits to doing this. And in the chance that we do have an emergency, the midwife and her team is probably going to be just fine handling it.
Got it. Got it. Nice. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Would love to, yeah, would love to talk about, in general, people listening are probably interested. What are some of the most important things when it comes to, birth that maybe, again, people aren't thinking, people who just had, hospital births maybe aren't familiar with or aren't thinking about. And then also, postpartum as well. Would love to get into that. And then maybe towards the end, we can kind of, also even just talk about general kind of holistic OB-GYN, advice that maybe you could give people who maybe already had kids a few years ago or something like that. But kind of like, let's start, I guess, first with the birth part. What are some of the most important key kind of pieces there in terms of like what you see, again, you've done 1,000 births now, I think over 1,000 births, right? So are there
Yeah, I don't
certain,
even know how many.
yeah, thousands, right? Probably. And then, what are some of the things you see like where something is, I guess, quote unquote, successful birth or, went really well, for the family and the kid and the health of the kid, versus not?
So it's a good question. To try to kind of consolidate this down to principles, I would say the more that we intervene, the worse our outcomes. So that's relevant if you had a hospital birth. You wonder why did I end up with this problem happening? There's a good chance, not a guarantee, because sometimes we do need the heroics of surgeons in operating rooms. But
Sure.
generally speaking, when we intervene, when we try to control birth, similar to when we try to control waterways, we lose the battle against nature. Nature has figured this stuff out in such a way. Your body is infinitely wise. It's not magical thinking. It's just the reality. We don't have the ability to do as good a job as nature. So we should reserve any interventions prenatally or even at the time of birth or postpartum. We should reserve our interventions. Our toolkit should remain under the desk until we absolutely need it. So sit on your hands and just wait and be more patient. The second thing is that anything, including an IV, including a needle stick, including somebody putting their hands inside of you, absolutely everything, including a C-section, you have to provide consent for. Now, the way that us doctors get around that is we will counsel people in a way that makes it seem absurd if they were to decline our recommendation. You don't want your baby to die, do you? Well, no, but I also don't really want a C-section. Is it necessary? Well, we're really worried the baby's going to be in trouble. I think it'd be better to do it now than do it later in the night. And I'm saying this in a way that I used to counsel. This is what I was taught to do. But it doesn't really give a person a true option. So people oftentimes reach out to me on Instagram or TikTok or whatever. They're like, can I decline this? And it's like, I don't know how many times I can say this, guys, or how I need to reword it. But every little thing, including the IV in the hand, is absolutely something that requires consent. It's otherwise assault. Believe it or not, that's actually what this is. So if there's a hell no coming on the inside and you say yes to something, that will reemerge later in your life as I wasn't guided by my soul. I didn't listen to my intuition, and that's important. So you deserve counseling, which includes risks, benefits, alternatives to every intervention, using non-coercive language, not while you're under duress, like when you're actively contracting or having horrible pain waiting for an epidural, and then for your doctor or your midwife or whoever to support you in that decision. A real expert in childbirth is able to help a person navigate this whole system without imposing their own preferences and values on them. But again, we don't really have a lot of time with our OBs. Like they're 7 minutes on average is the length of the visit. So when are we supposed to elicit those values? That's why I couldn't do what I do in the system. That's a big reason why I stepped away. So I think those 2 points are really critical for people to hear. And whether you're having babies in the future or you're pregnant now, remember that you have to consent to everything. And the more that we intervene, the bigger problems we create.
Yeah, it really resonates what you said about patience, right? Like you can see that I can imagine the difference between, kind of an at-home birth where it's just patient. There's no rush. We're not trying to get someone in and out of there. We're not forcing the matter. We're not inducing and doing things like that unless it's absolutely necessary, right? It's kind of like, I kind of know. I mean, I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I kind of feel like in the hospital, it's like, oh yeah, oh, you're past your date. Let's induce labor, kind of a thing. We don't want to waste any more time here. It's really a good point you make there about patience. What about the next step then? So kind of like, do you have any kind of advice about after birth then?
Yeah, something that we were riffing on before we started recording was really related to, I think, a male's, like the partner, because it doesn't have to just be a heterosexual partnership, but whoever's not giving birth, what is your role? What is your opportunity here is how I reframe this. There's not really a job for you. There's not a problem to solve, but there's a great opportunity for you to step into your divine masculine. And what I mean by that is to hold the fort down, like anchor yourself and be a person who's comfortable not being there to solve a problem, but just being there to bear witness to what's happening and letting your partner know they're bringing your baby into the world. Just letting them know, I've got you, I see you, I'm here with you. It's not just a verbal thing. It's actually something you work through in the entire pregnancy, is getting comfortable with the unknown and being willing to surrender to the possibilities of anything happening, including having the most, rapturous, ecstatic moment of your life. There's
Mm-hmm.
not a problem to solve here. Now, if there is a problem to be solved, somebody will say, hey, so and so, can you help me with this thing? But your
Mm-hmm.
job in childbirth is to just be there. And yeah, there's acupressure points, and you can bring them, your partner water and food and all of this. But even beyond that, if there's no problem to be solved in the birth itself, then what is my role? Well, your role is to help to prepare your relationship, to dial in your communication, your connection, your intimacy for the 18 years later after that moment of birth, which is the easy part in many regards. I mean, you and I both know that it is a journey with young kids. So getting your health, your connection, your communication, all of that on board, both you and your birthing partner, for the 18-year roller coaster ride that's going to come, that is actually the work. And that is
Mm-hmm.
really the ultimate expression of masculinity, is realizing that this isn't a problem to be solved, but you got to get your stuff together well in advance. And then when that flashbang goes off and now there's a baby in your world, and now you've got your health is intact, your communication's intact, and you guys can lean into this in the most beautiful way possible, as opposed to being hit with a freight train of responsibility now, not realizing what this means. Like, what a big change to my life.
Yeah.
So that's probably I think that's a pretty vague answer to what you're asking, but I don't actually think that there's a prescribed way to manage, this postpartum period. I do think people tend to be pushed a little bit too quickly to get back to work. They fail to realize just how wonderful that first 12 weeks is, that lying in period. Don't go to the gym. Let somebody feed you, foot rubs, back rubs, get as much sleep as you can. Sleep with the baby as close to you as you can. If you're not comfortable co-sleeping, get the baby in your room in the bassinet. Like, waking up and seeing your baby multiple times per night is actually one of the most beautiful things ever, even if it's really, really hard on your adrenals and your HPA access and all of
Mm-hmm.
that. But some of my most favorite moments were waking up, and we have a king size bed. So we'd put her on this like little boat, both of our daughters actually, but
Mm-hmm.
we're not planning to have any more children. So every time that we woke up with our second in the bed, you get to wake up to this little baby gooing and guying and figuring out where their hands are. And it's just be there, be present. And that's, I
Mm-hmm.
think, very hard for us guys. I don't think anybody gives us permission to just be ever in our lives. And this is not, again, not a problem to solve. Just be with your kids, bear witness to what they're going through. Like,
Yeah.
study their little toenails. I mean, like, that is really the job of a dad postpartum. And likewise, for the mother, do those things as well. But if you're a woman out there, or if you're going to give birth, be sure to ask people. When somebody says, I want to help, give them a task right then and there. Can you do a load of laundry? Can you take the garbage out? Can you make us a lasagna? Whatever it is. People want to help you. And so give them the task. It's oftentimes one of our greatest love languages is gift giving, acts of service. Let them do that for you. It's not
Mm-hmm.
we're not like, we silo ourselves off in every other aspect of life. This is one time where community is really, really important.
Yeah, yeah, that's beautiful. Well said. And we all know the power of touch and love from the
Mm.
time when the baby's still even in the stomach, right? I mean, just the power of that positive energy and that love being showered onto them is just really, really powerful as well. So yeah, for sure, that is something really important. Um, I think a lot of people have probably heard, obviously you don't want to have a C-section if you don't, unless it's absolutely 100% necessary, right? In terms of just the health of the baby, in the future, after birth, it's not ideal. Um, I think many people these days have heard of some other issues like maybe with birth control pills. So maybe kind of moving into a little bit more general OB-GYN advice that, a lot of people listening who maybe had kids already as well. Kind of, and then maybe breastfeeding also, right? Like, how long would you recommend people breastfeed for? I'm sure I would assume you're an advocate of breastfeeding.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll start with breastfeeding because there was a string of questions there, but we'll
Yeah,
start
yeah,
with breastfeeding and then we'll talk about C-section and then we can fill in the gaps there because I actually think those two topics are probably two of the most common questions people have.
yeah, yeah.
The breastfeeding thing is so critical. And as a little disclaimer, I'm not saying shame on you if you didn't breastfeed, because there's a lot of reasons why a woman may struggle to, create ample milk supply and to get the right latch and all of that. But find yourself a really good lactation consultant if you're having issues. The benefits of
Mm,
breastfeeding over formula it is so vastly superior. It's a part of colonizing their gut flora. It's a part of giving them antibodies and immunoglobulins to help them fight off infections. It's a part of bonding with your baby. It's a part of actually expanding their palate and their jaw. Like when you get a suction in there, it actually helps to increase the space in their mouth so that their teeth aren't all bundled up and they don't end up with these narrow jaw lines, right? We want to have a big, robust, chubby, wide, frame in their face. And that's actually supported by breastfeeding. So the baby's whole mouth is going to be covering, like a third of the whole breast. That's important as a means of expanding this.
mm.
There is so much benefit to breast milk that if you're questioning whether or not it's reasonable, I would even tell you find another job way ahead of time who's going to let you breastfeed in the office. Like this should not be I just have to pump every day. That's still good, but we need to radically change the workplace because this is so critical to our, the incoming generations of children.
So you actually even just the distinction. Obviously, breast milk is far superior to formula, but on top of that, it's preferable in your mind to actually breastfeed directly versus pumping, because I know pumping is a huge thing, and I know many entrepreneurial
Yeah.
women and business women that I know. I know I've been in meetings where I'm like, "What's that noise?" And they're like, "Oh, sorry, I'm pumping," and like they're stuff like that, which is great. I mean, good on them for
Yeah.
doing what they got to do. But you prefer if they can actually do the direct route, huh?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not so much like, again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't be pumping and all of that. Like, I think that those are really good ways to optimize how long we can breastfeed. So, what I'm saying is, in an ideal world, there would be no shame, there would be no weirdness around breastfeeding. There's they have like these little booths now in airports that look like little cages for lactating women. And
Mm-hmm,
at the
mm-hmm.
same time, my wife is like, I like those pods because otherwise I don't know who's staring at my breasts when I'm breastfeeding in the airport. So our whole
Yeah,
society is just not in alignment with like,
yeah.
yes, there's breasts. Yes, there's nipples, guys. And those are going to be feeding the babies. Like it's just such a bonehead thing that we have to struggle with.
Yeah,
In an ideal world, your baby would be on your chest breastfeeding every single time that they feel hungry. But
yeah,
that's not practical. So I realize that. I realize I'm also a man. I've never done this. I get all of that, guys. But
yeah.
the benefits to the baby are so demonstrably superior for actual breastfeeding. Even if you're just breastfeeding at home and pumping at work, whatever you can do to get that milk in their mouth and for them to be
Mm-hmm.
on the breast as much as possible, I'm a huge fan. And you asked how long. I'd say
Yeah.
at minimum 6 months. Our first stopped at 8 months, just wasn't interested. Our second, it was we kind of compelled her to stop around 18 months, but she like wasn't feeding anymore. She just wanted to like be laying there with the boob in her mouth. And it was starting to get really hard for my wife at night. So she was like, I think it's time. She was feeling okay with it. Our baby
Yeah.
didn't seem to mind, hasn't been like asking for it,
Mm-hmm.
afterwards. So I would say at minimum 6 months at most. I do think that we can teeter into some attachment disorders after maybe 3 years. I know some kids 5, 6 years they're still breastfeeding, and I know that
Wow.
it does end up to be a bit of an attachment sort of
Yeah.
disorder. Now, I'm not an expert in child psychology and all of that, but I know that people have had a really hard time when they've waited that long. I'm curious, what are
Yeah.
your thoughts? What did you guys do?
I think we did about 9 months on each baby. Yeah, and
I
and,
think
and
nine
it
months
felt,
is
it felt
great.
about right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's some really lovely videos of women who videotape their interaction with their toddler when they decide that that's the end of breastfeeding, and sometimes it's their last child.
Mm-hmm.
And I was watching one with my wife, and this little girl was about our oldest, about 3.5 at the time, They had this beautiful exchange where she was saying, "No more milk, honey." And she was like, "No more milk? Like, why?" She was like, "Well, I just think it's time for us to try something else, you know?" And of course, this little kid's eating food and drinking water now, doing all the things. It was just this great connection that they had together. And as the mom's explaining it to her, she starts crying. And this little girl grabs her face and says, "Don't cry, mama. It's going to be okay. I don't have to have milk." Like, it's a really lovely, very, very important connection that we have with our kids breastfeeding. So there's no right or wrong way to do this. I
Yeah.
do think that it provides a really incredibly special opportunity for new moms to really lie in and nest and really get to know their newborns, little tells and how they wiggle their toes. Like, there's so much more to it than just what's the fat and the protein content and all this other stuff.
Right.
And then I'll also add that formula, most of those have like so much crap in them, like soybean oil and all kinds of artificial stuff. If there's any way to get away from formula, whether it's donated breast milk or pumped or
Yes.
straight off the breast, like, I am always going to be an advocate for that over the formula, unless it's like a worst case scenario kind of thing.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. Great. So C-sections then, be curious to know, obviously, ideally you wouldn't have one. I think even in your case where you try to avoid it, there's still maybe a couple % of people who may absolutely need it. Maybe talk about who, in what situation would you absolutely need it? And in what situations do you think it could be avoided where, 30, I think there's like a third of hospital births are doing it.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I brought up continuous fetal heart rate monitoring. Now, we're not talking about listening to the heart tones. We are talking about a continuous monitor on the baby's heart, which was introduced in the 60s, 70s, became universalized in the late 90s, early 2000s. And since it's been universalized, not only is it very uncomfortable for women, it has not led to better outcomes. If anything, it has contributed massively to this soaring C-section rate across our nation. The average is, I think, 37% nationally, which is not a number that we should be boasting. Not like USA, way too high.
Yeah. Wow.
So that was probably the number one contributor. When we've compared intermittent auscultation, which of course is that's what midwives do at home, it's better outcomes. It doesn't lead to, to greater, injured babies or anything like that, despite what the media and what your doctors tell you. It just doesn't. And I'm like pretty firm on that. So the main reason people are told that they need to have a C-section is the baby's not doing well, right? There's fetal distress or whatever. And that's due to the continuous fetal heart rate monitoring. So if we scrapped that and did intermittent listening, we probably would have better outcomes. The second big thing is if a baby's butt down, we have not trained doctors and midwives now for several decades as to how to help assist a breech baby. So it's an automatic C-section in most, if not every, major medical institution in the United States. The third is if you had a C-section in the past, whether it was for one of those reasons or something completely different, and sometimes there are good reasons for C-sections we'll get into, with a history of prior C-section, you're going to be basically prepared to have another one at roughly 39 weeks every single time. So that's called the opposite of that would be to have a trial of labor after C-section. The good news is the risks of having a trial of labor after C-section, also known as TOLAC, are exceedingly low, less than 1% that the uterus is going to rupture where it was previously incised. That's the big fear. But if that does happen, you need an operating room right away. So again, it's the risks and benefits. You have a 99% plus chance of that not happening. But for that less than 1% chance, most people just go to the hospital and accept what their doctors have told them.
And
there's not a lot of uterine ruptures happening.
The doctors don't want to take a 1% chance either, right? Because that's on that, know, because then they feel like, so they're going to do it. They're going to just tell you to do it because they don't want to, even if it's a 1% chance, they don't want to take that risk.
Well, that's true, Talor, but there is more to the story. Let's say that you had your first C-section for breech, and then the second one you decide, oh, to heck with it. Let's just have another one. I don't want the risk. And then the third one rolls around and they find this interview and now they're listening to us and they're like, if the risk is that low, I mean, the hospital births have been terrible. I don't want to be in the operating room again. Maybe I'll try to do a home birth, with a midwife, have a trial of labor after C-section, a TOLAC, with the goal of having a VBAC, which is called a vaginal birth after cesarean. If instead you said, let's just do a third C-section, and you decided in your fourth or fifth pregnancy to go for that VBAC, the problem is that as you have more C-sections, the risk of your next C-section goes way up. not to mention being strapped down crucifixion style in an operating room with bright lights and all this alien noise and everything is not a great way to bring a baby into the world.
Yeah.
So all those immeasurable facets are never reflected in the literature or in the counseling of OB-GYNs. Furthermore, when you've had multiple incisions on your uterus, you have a greater chance of the placenta growing over the cervix, which is one of the true indications for C-section. But if you've had prior C-sections, the more you've had with a placenta previa, where it's growing over the opening of the cervix, the placenta can actually grow into that prior site where you operated. And that's called an accreta, or worse, it grows all the way through and grows into other organ systems. And now you're faced with a true crisis. That means we have to do a full sort of reconstructive surgery in your pelvis at the time of your next C-section, including removal of the of the uterus. And the risk of that stuff happening is far greater than the risk of your uterus rupturing after that first C-section. Even after 2 or 3 C-sections, the risk is not that high. So we don't do all of that counseling. All that we talk about is, hey, it's easier just do the C-section. It's so easy. Well, what about the risk to future pregnancies? That's really, I think, where our focus needs to be. And also just doing a C-section after somebody's had multiple is a lot harder. It's far harder. There's all this scar tissue and everything. It's a much harder surgery. So yes, we're good at C-sections, but we're good at C-sections because we've done way too many of them. And if we, instead of focusing on how can we do faster, better C-sections, if we focused on, hey, how can we support women having autonomous births, whether it's in or out of the hospital is not relevant. Having a vaginal birth really should be where we're putting all of our, our money and our advocacy.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That was very informative. Thank you for that. I know we're coming close to the end. I did want to see if you had any kind of just final, general OB-GYN kind of like, cause I love how you're coming from this holistic point of view. You're not entrenched in just following the medical system. Is there any other, big pieces of advice that you could kind of, give our listeners, maybe not directly related to childbirth?
Well, I actually think what I'm about to say is very relevant to childbirth, but also to our overall care of women through the lens of whatever you want to call it, gynecology, women's health, whatever. So OB-GYNs, as I said, we're experts in surgery and we're experts in using pharmaceuticals to take care of sick people. The vast majority of women's health issues, including virtually every pregnancy complication, is due to some upstream cause of dysfunction. And when we bring in the holistic approach, we're not talking about just physical, like the labs and the imaging. We're talking about the mental aspects, the emotional aspects, and even the spiritual aspects of what makes us tick. This gets again into that measurable versus immeasurable. If it's not measurable, it's not supposed to be the purview of medicine. The problem is that the wide variety of things that women are suffering from are due to the over-reliance on technologies like pharmaceuticals and surgery without ever actually unpacking who they are and how they sort of express themselves in the world. So if we can dial in your health, and again, we can use that word lifestyle, but really we're talking diet, movement, stress management, setting emotional boundaries, how you sleep, how you hydrate, how you breathe. If we get those things, basic, foundational movements, like not even CrossFit, just like how do you move? Like, do you have good posture? Do you sit at a desk all day? If we can start to unpack all of those things, not only can we start to reverse a lot of the common issues within women's health? We're talking, PCOS, infertility, fibroids, abnormal periods, pelvic pain, all of that stuff. It almost always has an upstream cause. And if we're just going to throw pharmaceuticals or surgery at it, we're never exploring that. And furthermore, if you're pregnant and you want to avoid C-sections or any other of the major complications, including delayed or challenging postpartum recovery, placental issues, fetal growth issues, thyroid issues, all of that stuff. If we can dial in your lifestyle from the moment you get a glimmer in your eye that you're going to have a baby, and especially while you're gestating a baby for 9.5 to 10 months, then you're going to avoid almost every one of those complications. And that is being very much underemphasized by the conventional model. So the more that we can take a holistic approach to who Talor is, or your partner, or your kids, or whatever, the less likely you're going to become reliant on pharmaceuticals and surgery in childbirth or otherwise. And that's really what I'd love for people to take home.
Amazing. Amazing. Nathan, where can people find you? I think you got boot camp coming up, and then maybe tell people about that and let people know where they can follow you and find you and learn more.
Absolutely, Toller. Thanks for having me again. I really appreciate the time.
It's been great.
So the program that my colleague, she's a midwife at the farm, Ina May's famous farm in Tennessee. Her name's Sarah Rosser. She and I created a course, which is really a 12-month group coaching program whereby you meet with us every week in a group Zoom call, but you also have 100+ video modules educating on everything from birth planning to hospital interventions to the risks and benefits of every intervention under the sun to all of the lifestyle modifications that can help you have an autonomous birth and give you the most choices when you get to that point where you're about to have a baby as possible. We also get into the postpartum recovery. There's a whole unit for fathers. There's a unit on psychedelics and cannabis use in pregnancy, which is becoming an increasingly people are very excited about, the prospects of some of these agents being therapeutic or available in pregnancy and postpartum. So we cover everything under the sun that we've ever been asked. And we have these 12 months of weekly calls. The online course part is self-guided. You get lifetime access. All future updates are going to be yours. You pay once and you're in for life. Guided meditations, other resources, 250+ citations, checklists, you name it. We've got it all there. And if somebody wants me to be at their home birth, the prerequisite is you have to go through the Born Free method because it is that comprehensive. So we're doing our last enrollment for the program in September, probably around the time that people are listening to this. They can go to bornfreemethod.com, book an enrollment call, and we'll get you in that day. And then otherwise, people can find me. I have a podcast, the Holistic OB-GYN podcast. I am available on all the social media platforms at Nathan Riley OB-GYN. And then my practice, if people want to consult with me or they want me to be, helpful to them, whether it's through gynecology, women's health, or through pregnancy, postpartum, you can hire me as a consultant at belovedholistics.com. And I'm also like a pretty friendly guy. So just reach out if you have any questions and I will almost certainly be able to point you in the right direction.
Amazing, man. Thank you so much. This has been very informative and really interesting topic, really interesting information that you don't hear many people talking about. So really appreciate you and everything you're doing and all the knowledge that you're spreading. Thank you. Thank you so much for being who you are and doing what you do.
Talora, thanks. It's my pleasure. I know it's hard to build a podcast platform. I know the journey, and to be invited onto somebody else's platform is a real honor. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, can you please leave us a rating or review and subscribe? I've realized that while we have actually increased our downloads a lot, we're actually getting a lot of downloads, which I'm really happy about. We actually have very few ratings. And I realized that I've never asked people really to rate much. So I'm asking you now if you could please rate and review and subscribe. And if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to anyone that you think will get value out of this. Also, if you haven't checked out our line of products at buypeakperformance.com, you get 20% off your first order. That's www.buypeakperformance.com. We have some incredible products, including our organic high-altitude coffee. If you don't know this, coffee is one of the most heavily sprayed with pesticides out of any crop. So it's really important that you drink organic coffee. We've gone above and beyond to source what we believe is the highest quality and healthiest organic coffee in the world. We're also famous for our organic green superfood powder. You can get 20% off of that as well at buypeakperformance.com. We also have an organic vegan and paleo plant protein. See, most of the vegan proteins out there are using brown rice protein, which is really not a good source of protein, and it's also a grain. And if you're paleo, you know that grains tend to cause inflammation in some cases for some people. And so we wanted to make one that was paleo friendly and vegan and organic. We made an amazing amino acid profile, so it's really one of the best plant proteins for muscle building. So you can check out Peak Performance Organic Plant Protein. You can find that on our website. Of course, all our products are on Amazon as well. So thanks again. And again, please, if you enjoyed the episode, please forward it along to someone who you feel can get value out of it. And please leave us a rating, review, and subscribe.